Welcome to Ocean 201, History of Oceanography. We're going to be talking today about settlement of the Pacific Islands. And the reason that we start with talking about people and early explorers is that these people were essentially early oceanographers. I mean, they are not scientists in the way we think about scientists today, in that they were not studying specific disciplines, but they were integrating everything they knew about the ocean in order to travel between islands and to live and thrive. And so we'll talk more in this semester about chemical and geological and biological and physical oceanography, but for now we're going to start talking about some of the people who settled the Pacific and how they got from island to island. So we'll start off talking about colonization pathways and different scenarios for how Polynesia might have been settled. Then we'll talk about the basics of traditional navigation using a star compass and environmental clues. And then finally, we'll talk about the basics of latitude and longitude and how they're determined. So we start with this map of the Pacific Ocean and some different theories for how Polynesia was settled. So the traditional view is that Polynesia was settled by people known as Austronesians. And so these Austronesian speakers, it's a linguistic and archaeologic and genealogic group, settled New Guinea and the Philippines by about 20,000 years ago. So they're coming out of area around Taiwan, and they got to New Guinea and Philippines by about 20,000 years ago in the pink region, what we know as Melanesia. And then they got to Fiji by around 1300 BC, Tonga by about 1100 BC, followed by Samoa and the Marquesas around 500 BC, at which point they were really a distinct Polynesian culture. And then after that, it got to Easter Island and Hawaii as early as around 300 AD, and then New Zealand by around 800 AD. And so this is an area of active research. And that scenario that I outlined, which sort of is a continuous migration of people slowly throughout time, has been challenged recently. So it's a different theory that instead of this slow migration through Melanesia and then onto the Polynesian Islands, so through that pink route on the map behind, that people went through the green route to get to the main Polynesian Islands. And so in this scenario, which is based on genetic analysis of different people living in the region, the idea is that around 40,000 years ago, people settled Melanesia, and so that was a shorter direct route from Taiwan and the Philippines into New Guinea. And then much, much later, around 3000 BC, people, this is the Lapita culture, settled in remote Oceania and the sort of start of the Polynesian Triangle around 3000 BC. And this is still up for debate, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is a picture of, rather than this continuous expansion, a sort of slow, or rather than a continuous expansion, sort of periods of rapid intentional migration. And so after people got to the Polynesian Islands, then the question is, how do they get out from Western Polynesia? And it's thought that sometime around 1000 to 1100 AD, the people moved from that small blue region around Samoa out to Gambier and the Society Islands into that orange region. And then subsequently, people then went on to settle the farther reaches of the Polynesian island between around 1200 and 1290 AD. So some distinct bursts of exploration and expansion. And I guess a few things to note here. One is that the timing of this doesn't agree with historical genealogies, oral histories from native Hawaiians and other people in the region. And one of the thoughts there is that some of this work is done on radiocarbon dating, where people, researchers go and make measurements of objects at archaeological sites and then use the isotopic composition of carbon in the material to say when it was initially formed. But what radiocarbon dating requires is something to actually date. And so if material is not present, if you don't have anything to date, then you're going to be biased in your estimates. And so that's one explanation that people have floated to try and reconcile the differences between the oral genealogies and some of these more recent papers. And I should also mention that the idea of rapid colonization in a few distinct bursts really reflects that this must have been an intentional action, that it was people saying we need to move for one reason or another, or we're interested in going and exploring, but it was intentional, and people set out with the technology and wherewithal to go from one island to another. Because these are tiny specks in the ocean. It's not like you're walking from one piece of a continent to another. You are going out into the unknown, and you need to really have a good idea of what you're doing and how to do it. And I think it's important to consider that this the older idea of a slow, almost accidental expansion really reflected some of the biases of the people who were creating these theories, and that it was very Eurocentric and really likely racist explanation that was predicated on the belief that the people who were living here and settled here couldn't possibly have done it intentionally. And so we're going to talk more later about the navigational techniques and approaches that people took. But it's good to consider what you read in science in the context of the people who are creating it, and that this is an evolving field. All science is evolving, and that it is good to try and reconcile oral genealogies with our sort of scientific measurements and recognize that there are lots of different kinds of facts, and there's not often one objective truth. But we just keep trying to learn and understand and hopefully do better than people have in the past.